Okay.
Welcome,
Thank you,
boss.
David.
Boss, you're my boss. Um, so I want to welcome Professor Leslie King from Royal Roads University. You've got so much experience and such a wide array of expertise. I don't even know how to introduce you. I'm going to introduce you as like a guru of conservation and environmental research and development and Indigenous science, I guess, community relations and so forth. So
That's good enough.
that's enough. Yeah. And the reason why, aside from just wanting to chat with Leslie, that I wanted to bring her on was because for those that are in the course, so Deidre is on now. Hey, Deidre. We were just talking about Diane. Was the fact that we're entering a unit now that's focused on traditional ecological knowledge and biospheric sustainability, so kind of worldviews of the biosphere, and to kind of get at the idea that it's not Western science or not science alone that is the be all and end all way of looking at the environment and environmental issues, nor is it the only governance structure that is applicable or necessary going forward, particularly with respect to some of the major challenges we are having with respect to sustainable management of ecosystem services and biodiversity. Therein lies the opportunity to look at alternative ways of dealing with conservation. And one of the ones, and I'm really actually not very familiar with this one, so I'm really glad to have Leslie come on to have a discussion and take your questions as well about IPCAs as not necessarily a new governance model. I mean, in fact, probably it's much older than any governance that we have.
Right.
But it's something that I think is getting more airtime these days, and we can talk about it. So, but first, I want to just get, what I'd like to do is just get a bit of background on my guests. And I like doing this because although I know Leslie, and like I knew Robin Cox was on a few weeks ago. And she, when she started telling me about her background, I didn't know she worked at 9/11. Like she was doing, like all kinds of stuff. So, I mean, what drew you to this whole area of thinking and work in the first place, particularly conservation? Like, how'd you end up here?
Yeah, well, that's a very, very long story with lots of stops on the way. But I grew up in Vancouver, and my father used to take me in his boat, and we'd go up to all the coastal communities in BC. This did two things. It made me fall in love with the natural world. Yeah. And at that point in my life, I had no idea that it was endangered in any way. It was the wild wilderness of coastal BC. But it also made me fall in love with First Nations people, and especially their ways of knowing and being.
Right.
And then fast forward a long time, I was adopted by the Nisga'a and Tsimshian. So that's been always a motif throughout my whole career.
Okay.
I started in the first program, the first class of the first environmental science program in Canada. Well, it was actually environmental science and studies. So it was definitely an interdisciplinary program. And I gave an address on Earth Day, and I said that this was my 51st Earth Day. And my first Earth Day was the year that I enrolled in that first environmental program in Canada. And then I went on to found environmental studies programs all over the world. We can stop there.
Okay. But I mean, this has basically been a part of your DNA ever since you've been a kid then, more or less.
Absolutely, without any doubt.
And I think, like, I was born in BC as well. I was born in Nelson. So I think...
well, you've got it in your blood too.
Yeah, probably a lot of THC as well for Nelson. But the thing is, I think part of the ethos of people that come from BC, I think our environment is a big part of that. Like, and I've seen that, like, having lived and studied in other parts of Canada, it's just basically part of what we're all about, really. So it's nice to kind of meet a fellow BC person and just have the similar type of story. But
it's made us complacent, David. I
Yeah.
really think, the supernatural British Columbia, it's
Yeah.
made us very complacent, and we have nothing to boast about in terms of preserving biodiversity.
Well, right now, particularly, we got some major forestry issues. Like, I
Right,
thought that was a done
exactly.
deal, right? Back in the, the Clayoquot Sound era. No way.
And
Um,
that relates to IPCAs.
exactly. So in terms of conservation, though, like in terms of the environmental science discipline, conservation is almost a discipline unto itself. I mean, you have conservation biologists and so forth and so on. But at least from my limited experience, which has largely been through like international projects that have a conservation component, like in dealing with CI and groups like that, is I've noticed there's been a pretty significant change over the last 10 to 15 years, particularly in the last, I would say 5 to 10, in how conservation is kind of implemented or done. And seems to be a greater emphasis on, recognizing the fact that there are human requirements in general, but particularly in conservation areas. So what are some of the changes and trends that you've seen in conservation over the past, like let's say 10 years?
Yeah, well, I think they're similar to the changes in the environmental field. There's
Yeah.
been a burgeoning of educational programs on environment and on conservation biology, but also restoration, all kinds of different programs that more or less include the human element.
Mhm.
But I think that is recent indeed. What upsets me, David, is that in spite of the fact that we have all these programs, all these educational programs, and these are not just for professionals, they're for the public,
Mhm.
and we haven't got very far.
Yeah.
We haven't accomplished very much.
Mhm.
And that's what's haunting me these days.
Mhm.
I've been an advocate of incorporating environment and conservation into the academy
Mhm.
and legitimizing it in the academy. I'm
Yeah.
not sure it's done that much for preserving biodiversity or for environmental issues, for even raising awareness of environmental issues.
Mhm.
That troubles me a great deal.
Right.
Anyway, I'll leave it there.
Um,
We don't
so,
want to get too depressed.
well, yeah, no, but I mean, we ran into these issues with the climate task force, right?
Yeah, yeah,
So,
yes, of
uh,
course.
I think, I try and be optimistic about this stuff because, as you know, I work in the private sector as well and understand the constraints of business and all that kind of stuff. But when I see some groups out there, like the Pumas of the world and some companies that are actually doing legitimate things for biodiversity and ecosystem services, like really tangible, practical
Yeah.
things, and they do it in a way that doesn't impact their bottom line. In fact, if anything, they benefit from those practices. I say to myself, well, what's holding this up? Like, why aren't other people doing this? I mean, is it laziness, or I don't know what it is, if it's lack of kind of creativity, or I'm not sure.
No, I think it's the strength of the industrial complex
Yeah.
and the economic outlook that goes with it. I really do. I think it's a deeply rooted, although not that, I mean, fairly recent. It hasn't always been that way.
Yeah.
Sense that the economy comes first,
Mhm.
no matter what. And most people agree with that. And I've been talking to a lot of people about COVID recovery.
Mhm.
And I hate the slogan building back better
Yeah.
because it implies that we're just building on what we were doing before
Right.
and back to what we were doing before.
Right.
And there's no way we should be doing that. We should be doing things very, very differently in
Yeah.
order to truly recover from COVID.
Well, and also I think it's become a bit of a slogan as well.
Well, of course it
I hear it
has.
all the time. Like,
I know.
what's the other transformative change? That's the other one, right? You hear
Yeah,
the
I know, I
phrase,
know,
yeah.
I know. Exactly.
So, however, I mean, that's not to say that it can't be done differently. And there are opportunities out there. In fact, one of the things I've been reading today from Guyana, in fact, is looking at, well, how do we fundamentally, support a recovery effort by ingraining the SDGs and these kind of like environmental statistics tangibly into a new development trajectory. So I don't know. I think if we put our notes,
I agree with you, David. I am a bit skeptical, but I think embedding things in existing institutions is certainly one way to go. but
Mhm.
also shoring up old institutions like First Nations institutions and
Mhm.
Indigenous institutions,
Mhm.
and creating new institutions is
Mhm.
really where we need to go.
Mhm.
I didn't know we were going to talk about this, but
All right, all right, wide open. But so, given that, given the idea about new institutions, IPCAs, what are
right.
they? What are IPCAs?
Indigenous protected and conserved areas.
Okay.
And the term IPCA was really brought to prominence by the Indigenous Circle of Experts.
Okay.
But they have existed long before that.
Mhm.
And so really interesting. They brought it to prominence at a time when we were trying to fulfill our HE targets or our biodiversity targets. And they said the pathway to target one is to encourage IPCAs. Um, the first IPCA that I really became aware of was the Mears Island, the Cloaquet IPCA that was created in the aftermath of the War in the Woods.
Mhm.
And now, of course, Cloaquet has 5 IPCAs, I believe, and they cover most of Cloaquet territory,
Okay.
which of course is Tofino and surroundings, and it incorporates the marine environment as well as the terrestrial environment
Mhm.
and the Kennedy Lake watershed.
Okay.
And at the time that they declared the Kennedy Lake watershed, people weren't really tuned into IPCAs.
Mhm.
And I thought it was a wonderful act of hubris
Mhm.
that they declared their entire traditional territory a park, a tribal park,
Mhm.
even though, of course, the government of Canada would say that it did not belong to them.
Mhm.
And of course, that's one of the big problems with IPCAs is jurisdiction, who
Right.
owns the land. And that's been a thorny problem for creating IPCAs. But
Okay.
now the government of Canada is very much on board and is even helping to fund some of these,
Okay.
which in itself could cause some problems because the key to IPCAs is that they're Indigenous led
Mhm.
and they're based on Indigenous laws, values, practices, and ways of knowing.
Right.
Without that, they are not IPCAs.
Right.
And however, more recently, they haven't been created unilaterally, but really in partnership with different levels of government, the Canadian government, provincial governments, territorial governments,
Mhm.
as well as Indigenous
Mhm.
governments. So they are becoming what you mentioned earlier, an ethical space
Right.
for us to come together for reconciliation,
Okay.
because those partnerships are critical. But also, Canada is recognizing that these IPCAs are really helping us meet our targets. And in fact, this is a little funny anecdote because I heard someone in the provincial government say that they were no longer supporting IPCAs because BC had reached its 17%.
Okay.
So once we've reached 17%, we're not going to do anything else.
Hmm.
A
Weird.
little, yeah, a little anecdote, but I don't think that that viewpoint is going to hold sway. I hope not,
Hmm.
anyway.
Mears Island is one example. Can you think of other examples throughout Canada of IPCA?
Oh, yes. Yes, indeed. After the landmark Chilcotin decision,
Mhm.
the Chilcotin have developed their IPCA.
Mhm.
There's one, the Cascadene have developed theirs. And I was just talking to a person from Labrador,
Okay.
and they have this huge IPCA
Okay.
in Labrador. So that the extent of these IPCAs really is adding up to be significant in terms of protected areas in Canada.
Right.
And, the assessment that was done by IPBES
Mhm.
showed that Indigenous protected areas were more effective at protecting species than national parks provincial parks,
Mhm.
those more official government entities.
Okay.
They are often in remote areas, which helps.
Yeah.
But the Guardian program goes hand in hand with IPCAs.
Yep.
And this woman from Labrador said that of 300,000 square kilometers, there
Mhm.
was one Government of Canada representative who
Wow.
was a stationary person who lived in a city,
Uh-huh.
a village basically,
Yeah.
and there were 34 Indigenous guardians.
Okay.
And the Indigenous guardians traveled throughout the territory, picking up any problems, any issues that needed to be addressed.
Yeah.
And so I think that's a really good example of how much more effective in terms of conservation these Indigenous conserved areas are.
Interesting. Have you, so internationally, so that's the Canadian scene.
Yeah.
International IPCAs, I mean, were those the World Biosphere? Do you know of any examples of international IPCAs?
Yes, there are a lot in Australia.
Okay.
And I went to the World Parks Congress in 2014.
Mhm.
And before that, I went to a big meeting of the ICCA consortium,
Okay.
which is International Community Conserved Areas, something. Oh no, Indigenous Community and Conserved Areas. I always get that wrong
Yeah.
because they don't like to use it as an acronym. They call it Territories of Life.
Okay.
And there are a lot of these with Indigenous people in Australia.
Okay.
And in fact, they're really the international model
Right.
for IPCAs, for what we call IPCAs.
Okay.
And before IPCAs, we generally called them tribal parks. So you still see some of those IPCAs called tribal parks.
Right.
And that resonates with the Australians. And this meeting had all the representatives of the IPCAs in Australia and many from New Zealand as well. And it was fascinating. I mean, I'm not that familiar. In fact, sometimes I feel uncomfortable talking about this
Mhm.
because I'm not Indigenous.
Yeah.
However, it is an ethical space for us to come together and
Yeah.
achieve reconciliation. So I do talk about it because I think it's a wonderful example of
Mhm.
where we can go with different institutions as long as we're willing to shore them up. We treated First Nations as if they had no institutions
Mhm.
when the colonial government and the church arrived on the scene.
Yes.
And of course, they were very effective institutions.
Mhm.
I love the Charles Menzies book, Saltwater
Oh, yeah.
People. People of
Beautiful.
Saltwater.
That's
Yeah.
one of the, it's a beautifully written book. Like,
Yes,
he
it
writes
is.
like a poet.
It's
Yeah.
a perfect example of Indigenous institutions being effective conservationists, and the colonial government treating them as if they didn't exist, and overlaying other forms of, dare I say, conservation, because it resulted in the demise of their livelihood,
Yep.
their fishing livelihood. But anyway, never mind. But it's a lovely example.
So those two examples of countries that are kind of at least started to in Canada's case, and in Australia seems to be more fully embraced IPCAs. Both of those examples are governments that I guess have kind of to some degree come to the realization that they have to have better relationships with those that they originally colonized. So
Yep.
do you think there's some lessons that they can share, like using Australia and Canada as an example, with other countries? Because when I think of, like, say, for instance, various countries throughout Africa, DRC and so forth, land tenure and Indigenous relations are like really tricky. You know, there's no land tenure system in some cases. So,
Yes, that's
I mean,
right.
really kind of have to have a co-governance model in place
Yes.
of some sort in order to make that work.
As long as it's not co-optive governance,
Right.
which it has been in many cases. And this is why I love the IPCAs
Mhm.
and why the Indigenous people are insisting that they're Indigenous led. And this gets a bit tricky because now that the government is coming towards them saying, you're helping us fulfill our conservation goals, You know, to what extent are they influencing or trying to tell them what to do? And that cannot be. And, you know, one of the big IPCAs up on the Yukon border, that's the Cascadene, I guess. You know, the BC government is not supporting it because of mineral rights and forestry issues. So they don't want the Indigenous people to prevent the exploitation of the region. I'm putting it very boldly here, but basically that's the bottom line.
Interesting. Okay.
Yeah.
But then what would you say are some things that differentiate an IPCA as a conservation area? You've already alluded to this in terms of governance and knowledge and so forth, but specifically in relation to, say, a national park in Canada, like how would you?
Oh, yeah, they're worlds apart. So, for instance, the colloquiate did what people have been calling a land use plan, but which the Indigenous people of Canada called a relationship plan. So it's not only, it's their relationship to the land, but it's also their relationship to other stakeholders in the region. And what they did was they basically zoned, this is the Kennedy watershed one. They've zoned it, and I've forgotten the names because they're in their language. And by the way, one of the key issues of an IPCA is it's embedded in the language and the culture, which of course the national parks of Canada are not, unless you want to call the dominant culture the culture. But anyway, never mind, which we could talk about. But they zoned it. So one area was called Leave It As It Is. And so that was a strict conservation area where nothing happens. Another was called, it's basically a play on the feast bowl. So it's an area that can be used. And I hesitate to say consumptively because it's never that in Indigenous cultures. It's always sustainable. And then another area for economic development where they have their microhydro project, they have their zip line, etc. And there's one more. Oh yes, health. It's a place to restore health so people can go to renew their culture and understand their culture. Now that is very different from a national park, very, very different.
100%. I mean, you can't even compare it, you know, like
no,
exactly. It makes a lot of sense actually the way you lay that out. I said, okay, that sounds like a place I'd like to go to. You know,
but it's interesting because, you know, so it's deeply based on their values, but at the same time, they incorporate some modern, I mean, they've done a big GIS study of some parts of it, and increasingly so now that they've named other tribal parks. They've used partnership with some conservation NGOs. So unlike some of the IPCAs, the more recent ones, and there are 27 of those, they don't have a real partnership with the governments, but they do have partnerships with NGOs, which is, I think, very interesting. And so they've sort of combined old governance models with new techniques of conservation, which I love. I think it's a great and very practical solution.
So given that, you've kind of led nicely into my next question, which is, you know, using GIS and, you know, advanced remote sensing or whatever, you know, there's all this tech, but what role does traditional ecological knowledge play in the management?
Huge, of course, because everything they do is based on their traditional knowledge and Indigenous science. So they know more about these areas than the DFO or the Parks Canada or anyone could possibly know because they've honed that knowledge over centuries, millennia. And so everything they do in the IPCA or the tribal parks is based on their knowledge.
Mhm.
And that's why I think it's a little dangerous to start thinking about co-governance and partnerships.
Mhm.
I think it's great to be supportive of them, but not to the extent that you lose that very critical component of
Mhm.
how they are completely based on traditional knowledge.
Mhm.
And people, and this is ethical space
Mhm.
where you have both forms of knowledge. You don't try to integrate them.
Mhm. Yes.
And the colloquiate are not integrating them when they use these other tools. They
Mhm.
use what's readily available.
Mhm.
And they will use scientific studies that universities have done in their territory. But they never let that govern
Right.
how they govern.
I was
And,
reading a paper the other day that I thought phrased it fairly nicely. Because I mean, this is obviously stuff I'm working on right now with my
oh,
stuff, right?
good. Oh,
Um,
good. Yeah.
but and I in fact I had integrate in one of the papers I was writing.
Oh,
And,
yes. No, no,
yeah,
no, no, no.
yeah,
I don't
exactly.
let my students talk about integrate.
Yeah, yeah. No, I quickly learned that.
Yeah.
But another way of stating that I think that was kind of I was made aware of was pairing
Well,
knowledge.
pairing is that's quite nice. I use braiding,
Braiding. Okay.
and sometimes weaving.
Weaving. I like
I'm
weaving.
so tired, I forgot that name,
Yeah.
that word. But I think, and the two-strand wampum belt.
Yeah.
Not so much two-eyed seeing, that's a little bit of a different concept,
Mhm.
but the idea that we are separate but equal.
Mhm.
And Haida Gwaii,
Mhm.
there's the original IPCA,
Mhm.
Gwaii.
Mhm.
And so I just love the concept of them writing down both sides of the paper for the agreement.
Mhm.
And so, as the Indigenous people say, the first point of their agreement was a disagreement.
Right.
And so they agreed to differ
Mhm.
in terms of jurisdiction, who owned the land,
Mhm.
and in terms of the laws and values that governed the management of Guayhanas.
Mhm.
And so they could only, that Haida wrote down one side of the page how they saw management of Guayhanas, and
Mhm.
Parks Canada wrote down on the other side of the paper how they saw it.
Mhm.
And they didn't try to integrate, they
Mhm.
didn't try to bring them together. They were happy to remain separate.
Mhm.
Now, sometimes that causes problems for the management board, as you can imagine,
Yeah.
but everyone's very aware of the basic understanding that they are different
Mhm.
and that they are not trying to incorporate each other.
Yeah, and I think one of the things that I've been working on, or not struggling with, but thinking about recently, and we've been using the Leo network for the course, and I
Oh,
had
good.
yeah, we use it as a part of an exercise, part of one of the assignments, putting an
Okay.
observation on there. It's kind of cool. And we had a guy named Mike Brubaker. I don't know if you know Mike, but he's one of the
Brubaker. Yeah.
yeah, he's with the Alaska Tribal Native Health. I'm sorry, I forget the name of the group, but he was talking about their kind of the underpinning philosophy behind the Leo network from its origination, which is essentially the One Health model. And the way they put kind of knowledge together, they put it in three, not two, but three categories. You have Indigenous knowledge, you have science, and you have local knowledge as well. So you have, like, say, local fishermen or what have you, who still have kind of on the ground, in the field knowledge of a day-to-day experience. That
There
is,
are many, many. There is women's knowledge, for
yeah,
instance.
well, that's it.
And I talk about knowledge systems. I
Yeah,
never, I never talk about Western science and traditional ecological knowledge. There
yeah,
are so many forms of knowledge, and I do talk about local knowledge. And this is very important in the dominant society too.
yeah.
We've kicked environmental problems up to the center,
Mhm,
and so we've lost all the accountability of
mhm,
local knowledge in
mhm,
making decisions at that level.
mhm.
Anyway, sorry, that's another area that I can go on and on about.
But it's easy. Like I like that, because I mean I feel the same way about that, and this is why the two-eyed seeing model, that paper, or many papers really on two-eyed seeing,
Yeah,
I
yeah,
see it as multi-eyed seeings. Although
I
I
do
get
too.
what they're getting at, No, I
Yeah,
appreciate it,
I
but
understand. I don't use it very often. Yeah,
there's multiple kind of lenses that we need
I
to take
agree.
into consideration. So given the fact that we've got all these unique characteristics that are associated with IPCAs, what are some unique challenges with their establishment and operation? Already you've cited one, which is who owns the land.
Yeah, and
What
that's
are
the
some?
jurisdiction challenge.
Yeah,
The other is who holds the pen,
yeah,
because that in many ways goes against traditional knowledge.
mhm,
But the dominant culture is very ready to hold the pen.
mhm,
And I think that's a challenge. You know, the interesting thing is that the key to IPCAs is that they're not just that they're Indigenous led, but they shore up Indigenous governance and Indigenous rights, basically.
mhm,
And so they're, in many ways, they're an expression of
mhm,
Indigenous rights,
mhm,
which they have never been able to really express before,
mhm.
except in the odd Supreme Court case.
Right. Yeah.
And so, you know, it it doesn't just shore up, it elevates Indigenous rights
Mhm,
and knowledge in the eyes of everyone in the society.
mhm,
And I think also it proves its value
mhm,
to the rest of the society. And
mhm,
that's why I think it's good in terms of the ethical space issue.
mhm,
Um, and you know, the other thing about them is they really are multi generational.
mhm,
So every Indigenous group who starts an IPCA is thinking about very long term conservation and long term generations.
mhm,
And I
mhm.
think that's another, and that was really expressed by the Indigenous Circle of Elders when they talked about it.
Mhm.
Other challenges, the money, the
Yeah.
money.
Yeah.
Now the Canadian government has pledged
Mhm,
what, 16 billion, 18 billion, something like that,
mhm,
to Indigenous communities.
mhm,
But we have no idea where that money's going to go. I hope
mhm.
some of it's going to water, obviously, and
Yeah.
infrastructure.
Yeah.
But I think some of it is intended for the IPCAs and the Guardian programs.
Mhm, mhm.
Um, so, but money is a double-edged sword, as you know well, in the
Mhm.
development world.
Yeah.
It causes dependence, influence, and all of those issues.
Mhm,
So I think that is something that we really have to keep an eye on.
mhm, mhm.
Um, I think power is another issue that
Yeah.
nobody's really talked about, but I think it's key and dangerous.
Yeah.
So, you know, Parks Canada says, oh, great, we're really in favor of this, and we're
Mhm,
going to come on board and help you with this. But,
mhm,
but they will have the last say.
mhm,
And, you know, many times when these IPCAs have been declared, and
mhm.
I'm making huge generalizations here,
Yeah.
please forgive me for that, because they're all different.
Mhm,
Um, but the feds or the province have come along and said, okay, we're going to declare a national wildlife area, or
mhm,
we're going to declare a provincial park as part of this. But
mhm,
of course, who's managing those?
mhm.
They are,
Yeah.
not the Indigenous community.
Mhm,
So I think that's a real issue.
mhm,
Um, Boundaries,
mhm,
always a problem. I
mhm,
mean, as I said, I thought it was a huge and wonderful expression of hubris for
mhm.
the colloquiate to draw boundaries around their entire traditional territory, regardless of what was crown land and
Mhm,
what was forestry land, and et
mhm,
cetera, et cetera.
mhm,
But that's going to come back to haunt everybody.
mhm,
And the case I said about the mineral exploitation and forestry exploitation is
mhm,
a good example of that.
mhm,
You know, they can declare that as a park, but
mhm,
are they really going to be able to stop mining, exploration,
mhm.
etc.? I mean, do they even want to stop it? And in
Well,
many
yeah,
cases, they don't.
yeah.
But
That's the question. I think one of
yeah,
the questions is, if there is some sort of natural resource exploitation permitted in the park, say in the economic zone, um,
Yeah.
who gets what? I mean, this is,
Yeah.
that's one of the questions that always is right on the table up front.
Yep. And the colloquial were very clear on that.
Yeah.
They wouldn't even enter into partnership. They have their microhydro is a partnership with BC Hydro.
Hmm.
But they were very clear on who was going to benefit.
Hmm.
And to tell you the truth, that microhydro project
Hmm.
funds a lot of the other things that they do with their tribal park. So
Okay.
they're very happy about it, but they have very strict rules
Hmm.
about who gets what, how it's distributed, all the rest of it.
Hmm. I think the issue of power is key. And this, I don't know. I mean, I know why people don't talk about it because it's a sensitive issue, but I
Yeah,
mean,
yeah,
ultimately, I mean, you want to put that on the table. I mean, that you have to deal with that issue. Like
yeah,
who has
absolutely.
how much power in what
Yeah.
given in a given situation.
And we all live in the same society. And I mean, that's where I think reconciliation is key
Mhm.
because they recognize that they have to live with us.
Mhm. Yeah, yeah,
And, but, it's easy for them to be steamrollered.
yeah. So given that, I think one of the things that we've learned, if we're at all students of history of environment and development in Canada, there's often unintended consequences of opening the doors to these things. And a
Yeah,
perfect example is the late Tom Berger, right?
yeah,
A few days
yeah,
ago, like last week. And like for those that are on the podcast are not familiar with Mr. Berger, is pretty much an iconic individual in terms of Indigenous advancement in the country. And from what I understand, when he was asked to lead the inquiry into the Mackenzie Valley pipeline, he was asked because under the assumption it was going to be a slam dunk for approval.
that's right. That's
Yeah,
right. You got it.
and it was Trudeau Senior who said, "I just go up there, talk to some people,
Yeah,
and then we'll kind of
exactly.
just start the rigs
Exactly.
going." And it didn't turn out that way. If anything, I mean, I often consider that to be one of the major turning points in,
Absolutely.
you
In
know,
Canada, you're absolutely right.
yeah.
There is a sort of a tribute to him
Hmm.
panel webinar coming
Hmm.
up. I'll send you the link.
Okay,
I've got it written down, but and I'll join it.
great.
Yeah, a hero of mine.
Yeah, well, he was actually my father went to school with him. They were
Oh,
buddies.
really? How
Yeah,
wonderful.
yeah,
Oh,
yeah.
that's
So I've heard
great.
some stories about him all my life.
Yeah,
So given that there's sometimes these kind of you open the door a bit, and depending on who walks in that door, some really crazy things or unexpected positive or negative things can occur.
yeah.
What is your view then on this proliferation of IPCAs, or at least the growth in their recognition as something that needs to happen, and also
And it's a good thing. Yeah.
the good thing, but concomitantly we have the reconciliation process, which is really, from more or less at the very early stage, right?
Yeah.
So what do you think is the opportunity or possibility for the IPCs to be a catalyst for?
Oh, I think absolutely it's a test case for reconciliation. How we handle this is a test case.
Yeah,
I am ever hopeful, David.
yeah,
I'm a bit cynical about our society, but I really am hopeful. I've seen more change in this country recently
mhm,
than I've seen in the whole rest of my life.
mhm,
So I really am hopeful, and these these people are very strong.
mhm,
They're very strong and very determined.
mhm,
And they are determined that these IPCAs will benefit their communities, but also the whole world. I
mhm,
mean, they say flat out that they are solving the major problems of our day:
mhm,
loss of biodiversity,
mhm.
climate change,
Yeah.
the pandemic. And nobody puts together the fact that the pandemic is caused by habitat loss
Mhm,
and the encroachment between the natural world and the human world.
mhm,
And the people who are creating these IPCAs are very clear that
mhm.
they're benefiting humanity.
Yes.
And so I think that will carry them a long way. And
Mhm,
I think when I talk about the hubris of declaring them,
mhm.
I think it works.
Mhm.
It was like me when I was a kid
Mhm.
and I wanted to do something that I knew my parents wouldn't approve of. I
Mhm.
just tell them that I was doing it
Mhm.
as if it was the most natural thing in the world.
Mhm.
And often they couldn't deal with that.
Right.
So,
Yeah.
so I just went my own way.
Right.
And I think there's something to be said for just doing it.
Right.
And you cannot argue with the effectiveness of their conservation.
Mhm.
And the Guardians, I think, are a real case in point. They were extraordinarily effective. And
Mhm.
they're also ambassadors.
Mhm.
And
Mhm.
they deal with the public, both their own and the dominant society every day.
Mhm. Mhm.
Settler society. I hate all those words for what we are.
Yeah. Yeah.
It's painful.
Yeah. No, it's anyway, when I get it, I understand where that's coming from. But I hear your point. So in terms of the future for IPCAs, um, I mean, their efficacy, I think one of the really telling signs is their efficacy, the fact that they're effective.
Yeah, that's right. I agree. But
Yeah.
we're facing a real issue.
Hmm.
How closely do we embed them
Hmm.
into the conservation system of Canada?
Okay.
Or how can we leave them independent but a part of that system?
Hmm.
How can we recognize them but not take them over?
Right.
I think these are all issues that we'll face in the future, but they are such a brilliant, hopeful sign. I
Hmm.
don't usually talk this way, but
Hmm.
you've heard me be very, very positive about them.
Well, I think those questions like how are they going to be embedded into a country, for instance, those are the questions I think that other countries like the Guyanas, like the
Yeah,
Perus, and like all of these other countries who perhaps have not advanced as much on these kind of at least examples within their country of effective co-management or effective IPCAs outside of like the national park system. Those are questions that will need to be answered in those contexts as well. So we have a question coming in, and I'd say actually the end of my questions. And I know
oh, good.
we have a hard stop at 7, so we got 15 minutes.
Yeah, I do, I'm afraid.
So we've got some questions.
Oh my
Everybody like?
goodness, I went on too much.
No, no, no. I mean, that's the idea, is just to have a conversation. So folks, shoot your questions in. We always like to, have this be dialogic, but also take questions. And so we've got one from Norman.
Yeah,
Good evening.
and I haven't been following C15. So Norman, can he talk, please?
Um, yeah, I think so. Can you,
Unmute yourself.
there, you're allowed to talk, Norman. Go for it. Floor is yours.
Talk. What do
Good
you
evening.
think?
Can you hear me?
We can hear you.
Yes.
Go for it.
My understanding is that Bill C-15 is coming for approval,
Yeah.
and I'm wondering whether it will have a concrete impact on things such as IPCAs in terms of perhaps modifying or canceling even the Indian Act
Oh, wow.
and,
Yes.
and, and all the consequences of that,
Hmm.
Yes. Yes, of course. And, that in
and
itself.
strengthening UN DRIP as well.
Yeah. 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 That's right. I think, well, we're all hoping for the end of the Indian Act, obviously.
Mhm.
And I think that again would reinforce the independence of the people who are creating IPCAs. I'm
Mhm.
not sure it's going to have a direct impact on the IPCAs, but I think it will be yet another reinforcement of their ability to do that
Mhm.
and to, if necessary, unilaterally declare them,
Mhm.
which of course they would not have been able to do under the Indian Act, but they did it anyway. So, and this is really interesting because all the things that have happened under the Indian Act, all the treaty negotiations are really called by many Indigenous people divorce agreements,
Mhm.
whereas the IPCA are agreements. you know, their relationship agreements, their future relationship agreements. So I think it can only be salutary. But, you know, I'm actually worried about Bill C-15. It's criticized a lot in the First Nations communities, as is UNDRIP and the way it's being implemented. But I think these are all to the good. Not a very good answer, Norman.
Yeah, I think also, I mean, although I'm not by no means an expert on Bill C-15, I mean, this isn't the first time that we have attempted to get rid of the Indian Act, right? Like the white paper, Trudeau Senior, you know, attempted to do that with the white paper, and it wasn't well done. You know, it was viewed largely as assimilation, right? And not.
That's right.
So we have to pay attention, I think, to how that rolls out and make sure that, you know, the groups that are really the beneficiaries or the ones that we're trying to address are okay with.
Yeah, I worry about the word beneficiary in this case, because, you know, the days of us passing legislation that affect the lives of First Nations people are long gone.
Yeah.
We just cannot do it without their full, free, and informed consent.
That's it. That's it. So it has to be, whatever the solution is, has to be fully accepted, I would say. And UNDRIP, again, if you look at, I like to compare UNDRIP, or not like to, but I often put it in the same category as the HE targets or UNCBD, UNFCCC. I mean, you have a broad international agreement, which is kind of vague, really, when you go down to the different articles of it. And what does that actually mean on the ground in terms of power, rights, and capability? And the real, the pavement hits it's where the wheels hit the pavement is where we really have to kind of look at how this plays out. And a lot of
John Burroughs is very skeptical about John Burroughs. You know, he's the Indigenous law guy at UVic. And I asked him once how he felt about C-15 and UN and UNDRIP, which is the way I pronounce it. But that's an international thing. And he was very skeptical.
Okay, interesting.
I didn't really get why, but.
Yeah, he's written, I like his writing. I've read some.
Oh yeah, he's wonderful.
Yeah.
He's great.
Other questions? We've got 10 minutes, so come on. You got an opportunity to shoot some curveballs if you want.
That was pretty much a curveball because I really haven't been following C-15 very well.
Anybody? Questions?
This is what happens when you talk too much. You dampen people's questions.
If no one's going to ask a question, I'll answer it. I'll ask a question. Oh, here we go.
Deirdre.
Deirdre. Okay. Just a second. I'm trying to.
Deirdre, do you know that I've been working on the Darwin Project in Guyana? I've been working with the people trying to yes, please. Can she unmute?
Yes, just a sec. I'm gonna unmute you, Deirdre. Where are you here? There.
I was very happy to hear that you were coming on.
Okay, Deirdre, you're on.
Hi.
Go for it.
Thank you. I was not expecting to participate at all. It was such a fascinating listen, and I have never met you, Dr. King, but it's just great listening to you. And I didn't know that you were working with the Darwin Project. I'm not in Guyana, but I am certainly still working on UNEP projects down there. I'm the focal point. But the opportunities, I mean, Guyana, of all the Caribbean countries, and David knows this, has some of the best stories in respect of conservation. They have a lot of issues. There's no question about it. And there's a lot of work to be done, especially with the new administration there. But they certainly have a lot of opportunity to work with the Indigenous community. And I really like the IPCA, and I love the jargon. Ethical space, that's not something I hear every day. And so there's a lot of great opportunity, and David doesn't know it yet, but I had intended to tap into his vast knowledge on how we can continue working together and trying to understand how to these incredible guardians of the forest who have been there for centuries, and they have kept standing forests on the lands that they occupy, and they roam through, and it's their home. And where Guyana is on the shield there, I mean, they have done an incredible job keeping the forests intact. But guess what? Just as you said, mining and forest concessions are a huge threat to biodiversity loss. And of course,
Deirdre, I was just talking to one of your compatriots who was saying that they're going to the Human Rights Commission, 5 Caribbean countries, including Guyana, to sue the mining companies. And on the call, I was going, oh no. And then finally I got up my courage and I said, I guess Canada is implicated. And she said, Canada's notorious, but not you. She said, it was quite sweet.
Oh, wow. It's an incredible story. But
I'm dying to come to Guyana. I'm just dying.
Well, you've made me very curious about wanting to research the IPCA. So thank you for tonight. Thank you for inviting me.
Thank
so I'll stop here and hand back
Deirdre,
over.
I hope we can stay in touch. I'd love to have a chat with you sometime.
Most definitely.
I'll connect you too. I'll connect you too.
Thank you.
Great, thank you.
Pick up shortly on what Deirdre was saying. And Deirdre, in fact, we've got a couple more questions, and we've only got 7 minutes. But one of the things that I noticed, Deirdre, when we were doing our initial work in Guyana, was the fact that, as you know, in Guyana particularly, and this is kind of, I guess, the broad cultural issues that we have to deal with when we deal with any kind of environmental issue or governance issue, is the fact that you have very strong ethnic political issues in Guyana, right?
Yeah.
You have the Afro-Guyanese and the Indo-Guyanese, and there's lots of problems. Anybody who's done anything with Guyana knows about that. And what I have found is that you've also got the indigenous component that almost gets kind of like, I find it gets, pushed to the side when you have these kind of dominant political and economic forces coming up against each other.
Interesting.
So, I'm sure we'll talk more about that, Deirdre, you and I, as we move forward with that. So we got a couple other questions that I want to get to. I'm going to first give one from Michelle. So Michelle Hall is a former student of mine, and maybe a former student of yours too, Leslie, Michelle Hall.
Oh, yes, she is, definitely. Hi, Michelle.
So Michelle's here. Her question here is, the Guardian program in Chiloquit is asking local business to contribute 3% of annual profits suggested or other donation as a voluntary payment towards the guardianship program. A large part of the reasoning is that this region is a major tourism destination, yet Indigenous people are mostly let out of the profits gained. Do you think this will become the norm as communities work towards reconciliation? Also, you mentioned that governments contributed towards the Guardian program. Can you speak to that? So the economics of this, how do we fund the Guardians program?
Michelle, I think that's a brilliant program. It's called an ally program, where the tourism companies, of which you know many, have the opportunity to be allies of the Chiloquit in the tribal parks. The Chiloquit have also instituted user fees, ecosystem service fees, which is very interesting. So some of the kayak and canoe tourism, when they pull up on Chiloquit territory, are asked for a fee. And Michelle, I think there's both good and bad to this. It's putting a monetary value on a service that, of course, cannot be monetized, but also it helps fund conservation in a way where perhaps it's not as influential or as threatening to the autonomy of the people creating the parks. I'd like to know how you think about it, given that you're in the tourism sector in Tofino.
Michelle, I'm going to ask you to give us you got the floor, Michelle.
Hi, David. Hi, Leslie. Thank you
Hi,
so
Michelle.
much. Thanks for the answer. Yeah, the Ally program I really like. We're a part of it as Surf Riders. So we collaborate on, for example, on the beach cleans. And like you spoke of before, when we do a cleanup within the territories, we don't just decide to go and clean a beach. We contact the allies, the tribal park allies, the Taloquit Tribal Park, and we often do them in collaboration with them using their skippers and their knowledge and ensuring that we're not encroaching on any native plants or sacred areas. So I like the partnerships aspect of the allies program. I'm just not sure right now that the appetite for a voluntary payment system through the tourism sector is it's not as fast as it could be. I don't think a lot of businesses are jumping on board, and it's sad to see.
I wonder if that's got something to do with the fact that they're the hardest hit by COVID.
Tourism, yeah.
Perhaps, yeah.
Thanks, Michelle. It's great to see you and hear you again.
Interesting.
I've missed you.
We've got a few more minutes, so I'm going to try and get one more question.
Sorry, yeah.
So, Sarah, I've got a question. We've got two questions, but I'm going to give Sarah the floor first. So what would be the opinion of non-First Nations peoples visiting these IPCAs? So, and just, can you clarify what you mean by that? Like whether or not they would be receptive to that or encouraging, or like, I mean, I can speak for myself. I think it's great, you know. Okay, would they be receptive to that? So what do you think, Leslie? What do you think in your experience, having looked at IPCAs that are enacted and functioning, how do, like, say, non-First Nations who encountered this, what's their reaction to the situation?
Yeah, I think that the people who go to IPCAs are very, very much in favor of them. Now, the IPCA policies, for most of the ones I'm familiar with, are not geared to encouraging tourism. However, I suspect that might be something in the future, and it also might help fund. But, you know, the First Nations have, I think that they're a bit mixed in terms of the extent to which they want to invite the rest of the world in, as opposed to really trying to maintain their own independence and autonomy. And I think that's another one of those issues that they're going to have to solve as they go forward. I didn't answer your question, but that's my thought on it.
Well, I think you did. And then also you brought up another question is, what are First Nations reaction to people coming? Like, that's the other side.
Exactly.
Like, I think also one side is, and I see Sarah, perhaps one, at least, I don't know if you're getting at this, but I mean, you're getting a certain subset of people that are going to go to IPCAs or even know what an IPCA is, right? So are they receptive to it? Probably, because they know about it and they're into it, right? Whereas if you get some, you know, group from, I don't know, Toronto who, you know, just coming out, like maybe there might be a different perspective on things, like especially, you know, there's widely different views on First Nations issues in Canada.
I think they love the recognition. So one of my former students carved the welcome sign at the top of the Kennedy Lake watershed. It's a beautiful sign, and I think everyone notices it and loves it. Anyway, it's one of those question marks.
So we are at 7 now, so I know we had to do a hard stop.
Oh, I have to go.
But I want to thank you all for coming out. We had a good turnout, and then most importantly, I'd like to thank Leslie for taking the time of, I know you're very busy, and taking the time to hang out with us and, you know, riff on IPCAs for a bit and share some of your
I loved it.
Knowledge. It was great. We really appreciate it. And if you have any more questions, then you can just email me and I'll try and get some answers via Leslie.
Yeah, most of you know where I am and can find me.
Yes. All right. Well, thanks everybody.
Deirdre, great to meet you.
Yeah.
Take care.
Thank you too. Okay. Take care. Thanks, Leslie.
Bye. Thank you. Bye.